reckoning for racial justice in the United States of America. And while the killing of George Floyd sparked this wave, we all know that what's happening right now is so deep and so historic and so systemic that I think it's really important for us to kind of talk about it. As far as things have been materializing here at home, as many of you know, as many of you have probably been out in the streets yourself, either bearing witness or participating in protests. We have just been having, 2 to 3 weeks of relentless protests for racial justice, accountability in our policing, but also a conversation about racial injustice overall and what that means in our communities. And so I want to just take the time to acknowledge all of what we're feeling right now, whether it's anger, rage, grief, despair, but also the hope of this moment, also the productivity that we're starting to see. And so today, today's conversation, I want us to dedicate entirely to policing, policies, and all of the range of policies that we're seeing that are happening right here in the state of New York and across the country. Whether we are being joined, we're going to be joined today with Senator Jamal Bailey, who is the author of the 50A, of repealing 50A here in the state, which passed after, we were just talking, a long fight, but also what feels like a short battle at the very end in this reckoning. And it's a historic watershed moment. And what repealing 50A does in the state of New York is that it ends the secrecy around misconduct, and it ends a lot of the hiding of gross misconduct by police officers and frankly, people using force in our community. And it allows that transparency, and that sunlight is a really critical element into making sure that we're getting change. So today we're going to talk about that. We're also going to be talking with grassroots organizers about some of the demands that we're seeing in the streets. There's a lot of conversation. People are hearing the words kind of divest and defund, and their kind of immediate reaction is, what is that? I'm scared. What do these things mean? This seems like it's coming out of nowhere. And so what we just want to do today is create the space to talk about it, and also give you the space to later call in and ask questions about it so that we can engage one-on-one and really talk these things through. But really, one of the things that we are seeing on the ground is this idea of divestment. For people who don't know, the New York City Police Department has a $6 billion a year budget. That is billion with a B. That's more than we spend on housing, homelessness, youth, and health services combined in the city of New York. There's plenty of reporting that actually says that the budget may actually be much bigger when you account for other expenses. And so this idea of reprioritizing our budget, this idea of moving funds and reinvesting into our communities, particularly communities of color that have been underinvested in, can actually help to dismantle crime and create public safety in our communities by preventing crime and preventing the kind of poverty, despair, lack of opportunity and education that leads to societal breakdown and violence to begin with very often. We're going to get into that. We're also going to get into some of the nitty-gritty conversations right here in our backyard. A lot of people also don't know that the amount of police officers in New York City public schools alone equals the same number of the entire Boston City Police Department, right there in schools with our kids. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, what that means for us, for our community, how we move forward together. And, I think what's really important in leading about this conversation is that it's very easy to take personally. People think that this is about, are some people good or bad? Are officers good people or bad people? And this conversation really isn't about that. In fact, what this policy conversation really gets to the core of is that this isn't really about good people or bad people. This is about systems. This is about policies. And this is about policies that are safe, that lead to safety, and policies that lead to a lack of safety. And so we're going to talk about all of those things. We're going to talk about those policies. And we're going to talk about how we get through this together. And I strongly, strongly believe that we are going to get through this together. We're going to get through this moment together. We're going to get through it stronger. We're going to get through it and the other side is going to be more justice, more peace. The other side of this is more transparency. The other side of this is more trust in our communities and our public systems. And, this is the work that we are engaged in. So let's just jump right into it. I want to bring on Senator Jamal Bailey here, who's very graciously spending his time with us. He's a state senator here in New York. For those of us here on the Bronx half of the district, he represents Allerton and many other areas. So Jamal, would you like to introduce yourself? But thank you so much again, Senator Bailey. I should say Senator Bailey. I don't put respect on your name.
No. Listen, it's just I'm just Jamal from the Bronx. No matter what your title is, like I know that your name is your name, and that's way more important than the title. The titles belong to the people. Our names belong to us. Congresswoman, if I may, I know you're not as formal either, but I say thank you for all the work that you do and using your incredible platform for such good and ensuring that it's one thing to speak, but it's another thing to educate while you speak. And I appreciate that you do the latter as opposed to the former.
Thank you.
I represent the 36th Senatorial District, which comprises the neighborhoods of We Share of Allenton, but also Co-op City, Wakefield, Williamsbridge, and the Westchester City of Mount Vernon. And I had the honor of being the sponsor of the bill in the New York State Senate to finally repeal Civil Rights Law 58, which, as you mentioned, was a complete guard and a complete bar to disciplinary records for police, not just in the city of New York, because I know we tend to think from a city-centric lens. That affected the entire state. So it was critical that we were able to get that done. And so it's been a great few days in New York State.
Can we just pause right now? And Jamal, I really just want to give you big props and claps for this. I mean, I want to talk to you a little bit about what this fight was like with 50A. Many people have been hearing 50A in the news and repeal 50A and all of this. And I think when it comes to these protests, people think that all these people just rushed to the streets and then just a law popped up and got passed. So talk to me about what this fight was like for you, and how did you dive into this fight? How long have people been trying to get this done? And what is kind of the path ahead, after this? What are some potential options and what that might look like?
Sure. So it starts with directly impacted individuals. Those who are closest to the pain are closest to a solution. So when you think about the mothers of the movement, the Gwen Carrs, the Constance Malcolms, the Valerie Bells, and so many other mothers and impacted family members, they were sick and tired of being sick and tired. They were sick and tired of police misconduct and brutality, and seemingly there being no end to it. It seemed to be the same show on repeat. We see something, nothing happens, we move along, it's a new day. And so with the tragic murder of Eric Garner, we'll just call it like it is, Gwen Carr had so much energy and she channeled that energy. And she started to link up with groups called CPR, Communities United for Police Reform, and some amazing folks on that side. And they were leading the fight in the legislature long before I got elected. In the New York State Assembly, Assemblymember Danny O'Donnell, he's the assembly sponsor. So I got to make sure I shout Danny out because he was the sponsor before I got elected, and he allowed me to pick the bill up. Mm-hmm. And when I picked the bill up, people didn't think that repeal was an option because of the nature of what it would entail. But I know, like Alex, that mothers have a way of being able to move things.
Oh, yes.
Like in the mothers of the movement, they pushed, they prodded, and they said, this is what we want. And they visualized it. They had a vision board, I imagine. And they said, this is what we're going to get. And they said, look, we need you as the bill sponsor to champion this. And I said, that's what I do. I said, this is going to be my top legislative priority. going into this session. And so off session, we held hearings. We held one in the city of New York at 250 Broadway, and we held one at the state capitol in Albany to make sure that, as you know, as a policymaker, whether you agree with something or not, it is always critically important to listen. And I wanted to make sure I heard out the concerns of the police department and those in law enforcement. And they had some salient concerns that we eventually incorporated into this. And they were the privacy protections. No matter what your profession, no matter who you are, you don't deserve to be harassed and annoyed for simply doing your job. That is not something that any of us stand for. But at the same time, the reason why we wanted to repeal 58 had nothing to do with the personal records. It had to do with the disciplinary records. And that was the fight. So I'm not sure what happened, but it might have been the convergence of COVID and the fact that we can no longer run from this. We saw the visual, indisputable video evidence of George Floyd being murdered. They usually say, well, let's look at content in the same 24-hour period. So as you mentioned, people are in the streets and they're protesting. And as you aptly put it, people aren't just going to go out there for nothing. You are literally possibly risking your life right now and to possibly contract COVID-19. And the people that are doing it, they're doing it because they truly believe that enough is enough. And so the leaders in the state legislature, they listened. And one of our own, well, two of our own, Senator Zelno Amiri and Assembly Member Diana Richardson, while attempting to peacefully protest, were pepper sprayed and detained by officers. Now, your title shouldn't insulate you from that. I want to be very clear that I'm not saying that they should be treated differently because of their titles. But if you go out there in a neon yellow shirt with your name on it, and clearly you are going to be a peacemaker and you are still subjected to the same nonsense, for lack of a better term, that so many other Black and brown folks are, there's a problem. So that made the perfect storm. And I think that we accelerated talks to a point that we've never done before. And we were able to do something incredible yesterday with the help of, again, so many great people. We were able to finally repeal 58. That's
incredible. And it's such a monumental achievement. There's no kind of understating, I think, as an elected official, the kind of opposition that can get thrown at you. It's scary making stances like this, particularly in the criminal justice space. This issue in particular, when you try to take a stand for accountability, it can be a scary thing to do. It's, a lot of people try to create decoys and to, have people misunderstand legislation. But the fact that you're able to incorporate legitimate concerns, make sure that no one's getting doxxed or anything like that. But at the same time, ensuring that we have real accountability, this is a huge moment. I'm wondering, what do you think, in terms of your perspective as a legislator? We're all part of a different team. I was kind of tweeting earlier this week when people, they were criticizing, like, why use the word defund? Why use the word defund? And it's like, this is the word that's coming from the streets, and these protesters, they're not running for office, okay? They are expressing their needs. And so you can't be having expectations that that protesters are going to be poll testing what justice looks like. They are in the streets asking for their demands. I'm curious, from your perspective as a legislator, what are some of the things that you're seeing that's coming up next? What are some of the fights and the victories that you hope are on the horizon in the state, in the state legislature and the state Senate?
Sure. So one of the things that you mentioned about, it comes from the people in the streets. So during the floor debate, when I was asked who was the driving force behind this, and I simply said the people. Because the people, that's who we work for. Yeah.
Isn't it a funny question? People it so points to how corrupt our system is, or it's like, what special interest group is driving this? It's like the public.
The people that demanded this with their voices, with their hearts, with their letters. I've received the most emails about 58 than I've ever received on any topic. Not criminal justice, the criminal justice reform, choice last year, the CCPA, all of the great things that we did last year, got a lot of emails. Mm-hmm. This put my inbox to capacity because people were tired. They're sick and tired of being sick and tired. Mm-hmm. As far as what's happening on the horizon, today we passed special prosecutor, which codifies the governor's executive order, so that the attorney general will be involved in police involved killings of unarmed civilians, and there's an ability for them also to get involved. That there's a question about whether they were armed. So I think that's a great step that we took. We passed a lot of bills this week, but as you know, as a legislator, you always have to be looking for another idea. Mm-hmm. And one of the other pieces of legislation that I've introduced, they concern juvenile interrogation about the Central Park 5, or now the exonerated 5, I should say, and making sure that never happens to another young person again. Because I can tell you both as my experience as a young Black man, also now as attorney, that can be very intimidating when you're in that room and being questioned. So making sure that counsel is present, making sure these videos that these questioning periods are recorded, and so many other things just to ensure that we're increasing, again, transparency. Because if you're doing the right thing, what do you have to hide?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Senator Bailey. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to especially on such a momentous week, to share with us and to share with our community everything that we've accomplished. Thank you so much for leading the charge on 50A in the Senate. This, we'd love to believe that this would have passed no matter what, but we all know that that legislation doesn't get passed unless people are on the front carrying it and championing it. And the only reason we were able to get this passed so quickly is because of all the long work that you and the Mothers of the Movement and so many other organizers had put in to tee it up so that it was ready to go when the moment came. And so thank you so much, Senator Bailey. For those of us here in New York's 14th Congressional District, he represents Allerton, but that's where we overlap. But he also represents Co-op City and areas of Mount Vernon and many other neighborhoods here in the Bronx as well. So thank you so much for Senator Bailey for joining us, for explaining this work that's being done. And it's so important that the movement understands that we don't have to bow to cynicism. We are winning. We are winning. And they don't want us to know that we're winning. They want to say, all right, you're done now, right? No, we're not.
No, can't stop, won't stop, as Diddy once said.
That's right. So thank you so much, Senator Bailey. I so appreciate you joining us this evening.
Congresswoman, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. All right. So that was Senator Bailey here joining us. And so that was the legislative component that we're seeing. That was Senator Bailey here of the New York State Senate, representing making the Bronx proud, passing repeal of 50A. But we also have the other end, right? As I said before, progress takes a team. And one of the things that one of the hangups sometimes that I have in our political culture is that we tend to think of legislators as, the only people that make change. And of course, change is codified in legislation, but it doesn't get started with legislation. Legislation is usually one of the final points of huge change. And the starting point, the seeds of change, is community organizers. It's community organizers. It is grassroots leaders, and it's people that are frankly very often seen as radical or they're dismissed and what have you. But right now we are having a really important conversation about abolition and abolition of the prison industrial complex. Also conversations about defunding the police. What does this mean? What is this framework? And, I think for everyone that's tuning in right now, if you're tuning into this conversation, whether you disagree with it, whether you don't know about it, I think what's really important is that we actually take the time to understand. And I try to do this myself. People know that I'm very opinionated. That's my job as a legislator. I mean, to be frank, our job is to advocate or not advocate, to vote for things or to vote or not vote for things, and to make that judgment call. But, I think despite having very strong different opinions, even when I think certain ideas are and ideologies and I identify them as dangerous, for example, white supremacy, I still think it's important that we always understand the world around us. And I believe that right now we're seeing a window open up where we should really listen. And I think it comes from the prison abolition movement. It's important to understand because a lot of times people, they hear that word and they develop all these ideas in their head, and perhaps they haven't read about it, and they're told by folks who also haven't read about it what it means. And so today we're going to be having Layla Raven on. She is an abolitionist organizer who helped put together the 8toabolition.com website and resource, where people are really learning about what this means, and they're figuring out what pieces of this really resonate with them, what makes sense to them. Because I think no matter what race you are, we're all having a reckoning in this movement. I think a lot of white folks are trying to understand that white supremacy is not just someone donning a hood or being blatantly racist or not liking people simply because of the color of their skin. They're learning that white supremacy is a power system, and that it is a lot of unspoken things that we often take for granted in our culture, in our laws, in our economy, in our educational system. And so I think what we're doing right now is we're realizing all of these different elements. And abolition has kind of emerged and has had a real voice in this moment. And so today I want to introduce Layla Raven. She's going to be joining us on the call. She's not on video right now, so you can listen for her voice. And let's talk about it. So Layla, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
So Layla,
hi.
Thank you so much for joining us. Tell me a little bit about yourself, and why don't you explain to folks who have never heard before what abolition is?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So hi, I'm Layla Raven. I'm a mom. I'm a native New Yorker, an organizer with Decrim New York, and a prison abolitionist. And just in the past few days, I worked with a group of other abolitionists on an impromptu resource called 8 to Abolition, which offers an alternative to Campaign Zero's 8 Can't Wait campaign, and to other proposed police reforms that we've seen that would direct more resources and funding to the state. Instead, we build off of the work of Black feminist theorists and organizers who've been working for decades to divest from prisons and policing and to invest in real solutions that build safety, like housing and healthcare. Mm-hmm. And so I think in the past few weeks in particular, like now there's this, we've been seeing more and more people talking about prison abolition. We've been seeing more and more people talk about defunding the police. I also think there's been a lot of confusion and distortions of what we mean by defunding the police. So I wanted to offer clarity. And as abolitionists, we believe in a world where there are zero police murders because there are zero police. We don't see policing as a strategy for making us safer. We know what makes us safe: housing, healthcare, childcare, resources for our communities that can help us prevent incidents of violence. Abolition has been defined by organizations like Critical Resistance as a political vision that, seeks to build a world without prisons or police, but it's also much more than that. It's a way of life. It's a rejection of punishment and disposability in favor of safety and accountability. Mm-hmm. I apply my abolitionist politics to every aspect of my life, to my interpersonal relationships, to my parenting. That looks like rejecting the urge to dominate others, speaking up and intervening when we hear racist and sexist comments from people we know, and taking accountability for the harm we cause in our life. So beyond dismantling the carceral state, it's decolonizing ourselves. Mm-hmm. And we've had this incredible opportunity in this moment to have this conversation on a broader level. There are many groups that have been working on toward abolition for a long time, like already with Decrim New York. we've been working to move forward policy changes that chip away at the carceral state that we know systematically criminalizes, surveils, and incarcerates people who are Black and brown, trans and queer, people who are poor, migrants, disabled people, people who are housing insecure. And so that movement has already, it's existed for a long time, but now I think in the midst of this global pandemic and mass uprisings in defense of Black lives, we have this opportunity to dramatically change and transform the way we live, the way we work, the way we relate to each other. And yeah, there's massive public support for defunding the NYPD.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that introduction. And you know, you said something that was really important, which is that people have been working at this for a very long time, because I think there's a lot of folks that think this is just someone random people that are just impulsively making demands, but people don't realize that this has decades of research and movement in it. And you also said something that I thought was very powerful, which is that this is not just about, for lack of a current better term right now, what we call criminal justice policy today, but it's also just about our theory of accountability in general. And so the idea of bringing these ideas even to your parenting, I think, is such a powerful, it's such a powerful testament to the fact that a lot of our idea of accountability has been socialized. And we've been socialized into thinking that punishment and only certain types of punishment is the only way to create justice. So I'm interested, I don't know if you want me to drive you crazy with the beginner questions or common questions, or if you just want to offer up some of the 101 most common questions that a person who first hears this idea asks and what your potential responses would be. I can think of a few, but feel free to take the floor.
Yeah. So the question that I've been getting over the past few days and that I always get is, what about the rapist? What will we do about the rapist? And I think, it's important to ask, as Miriam Kaba has asked before, what are we doing with the rapist now? It's clearly not working. So that's, I think, a starting point. Like, looking at the way that we're addressing the problem now hasn't helped. But then beyond that, understanding that up to 40% police officers have used interpersonal violence against their partners and families. And also that sexual assault is the second most common form of police brutality, primarily targeting Black women and women of color. So for a lot of our communities, police have not been the place that we go when we experience sexual or gendered violence, but rather has been a source of that violence. And that's actually how I became an abolitionist. I wasn't always an abolitionist. I think that growing up, we all hear and learn that when you experience a problem, almost whatever that problem is, you call the cops. But I was in a domestic violence situation about 8 years ago. And when a neighbor called the police, I was arrested with my abuser. And so we both ended up in jail. And later on, at that point, even, I thought I was an anomaly. I thought it was just like a misunderstanding. But then later, I learned of the stories of so many other criminalized survivors like Marissa Alexander, Brescia Meadows, Centoya Brown, or some of these survivors who are currently incarcerated like Gigi Thomas, Alicia Walker, or Tracy McCarter, who's currently being held at Rikers when, as a nurse, she could be on the front lines providing healthcare for our communities. And so often survivors of gendered violence are re-victimized by the criminal legal system. And we're pouring so many resources into this system that has caused our communities so much harm when we could actually be investing in models that we know can actually work. For example, one of the top needs for survivors of domestic violence is an alternative housing option when their primary housing becomes unsafe, or for young people who experience abuse or family rejection over their queer or trans identities. Again, the need is housing and resources, childcare. Those are the things that keep us safe. We also, there's no skills building education in schools on building healthy relationships or on consent and boundaries. We're not really investing in prevention. We are, enabling a system, again, that criminalizes and targets survivors themselves.
Yeah, no, it's such an excellent point. And we're gonna open up the line for folks in the community to ask questions in just a minute. So feel free to call in. I believe the number should be pinned here somewhere on the live stream. But Layla, I think you bring in, so we'll queue up the next, the next person wants to ask a question. But Layla, I think you brought up also something that's, what you said about the violence that our system also creates. I brought up this point earlier about, our people often make this about, are police good people or bad people? And this isn't, I don't think this is about that. I have family that have been incarcerated. I have family that have been in NYPD. This is not because we found all the bad people in society and employed them. This is because this is a system that can be inherently dehumanizing. And I saw this, I think sometimes folks don't even know, but the largest law enforcement agency in the United States is actually CBP, Customs and Border Patrol. And I think about, these officers in CBP and, this moment where children were ripped from their parents and we violated international human rights of thousands of people by separating their children, kidnapping them, trafficking them. I think the thing about this is that when you order a human being to do that to another human being, that is a system, right? That was a mandate. That was a policy that I think erodes at the humanity of every person in that situation. And when you order a person to do that, and of course there's conversations about why a person would follow that order, et cetera. But when you order individuals to do that in mass, it creates kind of a watermark of depravity, and it's systematic. And I think it's important for us to kind of talk about the humanity and all of that. And what people are also, it also raises just questions of, okay, justice, people, the police have done harm, officers like Derek Chauvin. And these are things that folks are wrestling with in Minnesota as well, because we are so socialized to think we should send that officer to go into the very same system that hurt us. And there's so much dismantling of that as well. And it's just, just something that's kind of just been on my mind as just all of us human beings that are kind of caught in these systems and violent frameworks. But our question is from James in Astoria. James, do you have a question for us?
Yes, I do. Thank you for taking my question. So I saw that this week Congress released a bunch of proposed updates for in terms of reporting, and I noticed in terms of regulations, they were kind of addressing points one by one, like chokeholds, no-knock warrants. But where I see some room for more growth there, it's like we're working on the streets to work on a local level, get the mayor to change his mind, but we need some more federal help because there's 1,000+ police offices out there across the country, all with different regulations, all with different standards. And what was proposed is very nice. I think we need a little bit more robust federal guidelines for what's appropriate professional behavior, guidelines in terms of dealing with use of force, and just kind of a more robust federal training, just because there's such a disparity between offices around the country. And I don't want New York to end up in a great place because we're working so hard, and then a town in Alabama runs into similar issues that we've seen across the country, 5 years down the road.
Mm-hmm. No, it's an excellent question. It also teases at some of the challenges that we have in terms of federal, city, and state levels. The same way that we can't mandate all schools to be to teach the same curriculum across, state by state in the same exact way from a federal level. That also, creates inequities and differences in policing. And so creating those federal standards, whether it's policing or whether it is public education, often requires Congress using the power of the purse and tying funding to meeting certain requirements. And so that's an important aspect of this. But it also raises this other question as well, which is that a lot of these use of force standards that we're talking about, whether it's a chokehold ban or whether it's other types of attempts to regulate misconduct, the Minneapolis Police Department had a lot of them and has a lot of them. In fact, they're a model on paper. They should be a model for what happens when you pass a lot of these so-called reforms. But the problem is that the Minneapolis Police Department clearly does not honor and has a culture of impunity where no matter what some of these regulations are in the books, they felt and they do not adhere to them. And so it raises this other question of how do we standardize it? One thing that I did today, I announced that this week I'm joining with Representatives Mark Takano, who he himself is a former veteran, and Representative Chuy Garcia in introducing a national ban on tear gas. And this kind of gets a little bit at your question, because we want to make sure that no police department in the United States deploys tear gas, which is a chemical weapon banned in war, against our own people. It shouldn't be used against anybody, but it is especially heinous to see our government tear gas our own people. And so, as legislators, we had to kind of figure out this question of how do we make this happen? It's easy to ban tear gas from CBP. It's easy to ban tear gas from federal agencies because Congress funds them. It's a federal agency. It answers to the federal government. But when it comes to local police departments, they don't answer directly to the federal government. They are responsive to local municipalities and states. And so the way that we were able to do that, and the way that we've approached it in this legislation, is by tying funding to ensuring that not only police departments are not receiving and stocking up on tear gas, but that they are also actually destroying the supplies that they have. And actually, we've seen a lot of documentation about departments that have been deploying long expired supplies of tear gas against people, which has a questionable health impact. In addition to the already known health impacts of tear gas as it is. And so I think one big element is tying funding to these standards. But I also think it raises this question of how effective are these standards to begin with? Those are additional questions, but the main answer to your question is the way that we can kind of standardize it. Our best tool is the power of the purse, tying funding to it, but it also asks these kind of deeper questions of, is regulating techniques really the most effective way of eliminating police brutality? I think, I'm not sure if Layla's still on the call, but I'm sure that she would have a lot to say in terms of raising questions about that and saying it's probably not effective. But at the same time, is it harmful? These are the conversations that we should be having. So our next question is Zoraida from Throg's Next. Zoraida?
Hi, how are you, Alexandria?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing well. So I want to start out by saying that I'm super, super proud of you. I canvassed for you when you first ran, and I think that you're dope. I think you were dope then, and I think you're dope now. I think you're doing a great job. So there's like a lot of things in my mind going on, swerving, right? Like kind of ideas in terms of how to deal with the police and, you know, maybe implementing psychologicals, annual psychologicals and things like that. But I kind of wanted to take a step back with my question. My question has to do more along the line of starting a conversation that's extremely uncomfortable in our society with regards to developing more of an anti-racist, multicultural kind of society. And it goes to the idea of white fragility. It's a term coined by Dr. Robin DiAngelo. And she has a YouTube, she has a book, and she talks about the fact that white people in our society, their whiteness is very fragile. And so there's a certain way to kind of go at this, both in their perspective, right? White people have to do their own work and kind of acknowledge this kind of thing. But also, we as people of color, we should understand it as being a phenomenon that does exist. And so my question is, have you ever explored the idea of having these uncomfortable conversations, even, you know, in your position and just your day-to-day, and kind of bringing in Dr. Robin DiAngelo and having her just have a session of teaching? So that's part A. And then part B of it is how that term directly correlates with the strong rejection of the defunding idea that it, you know, came out, and maybe that's the reason why maybe we should reconsider just how we're going at getting what we want, with taking into consideration the fragility of whiteness that's in our society now. Yeah.
Well, first of all, Soraya, what an excellent question. You have so many thoughts there, and it's so incredible. And, you know, you're right in that there's so much to unpack here. I think even the term white fragility can like really set a lot of people off and saying, what do you mean I'm fragile? You know, like this is offensive. And so it's almost ironic that the term is kind of self-evocative in that way. But it is an excellent thing that you bring up. You know, a lot of people don't know this, but in 2018, we had folks from then Stand Up for Racial Justice. Now they're called NAWS in Queens. I apologize. It's escaping me right now what it stands for. But they're essentially white folks organizing against white supremacy with other white people in Queens. And they very graciously kind of came into the space of the campaign and decided to have these kinds of person-to-person conversations to say, listen, this is how you recognize, like, this is how these problems are manifesting from all of these kind of subconscious scripts that we have learned. And it's not your fault. It doesn't make you a bad person. You're not like you are not consciously choosing to do harm. We are just raised in a society that by default socializes a very large amount of racism in our interactions, in what we deem to be okay to say to other people, in our media, in how we are taught, and the images that we are seeing, and the policies that we are accustomed to recognizing as normal. In my work as a legislator, I do see it a lot. Congress is, I don't know, I mean, it changed a bit, but prior to this term, Congress was about 90% white, which means there are a lot of blind spots. I have seen a lot from legislators and experienced a lot. And it's really, really difficult to confront and to see how some folks' political comfort is prioritized above other people's ability to survive and to live. That's something that I have to see every day as a legislator. And I would be remiss, in your second part of your question about like, how do we reframe this issue, this word defund, right? That, your premise is that the word defund is kind of triggering and getting at this issue of fragility. And I think that you're right, because fragility, what it does is that you see someone asking about something and you make it about you, right? Like someone says defund the police, and then you say, oh, well, my aunt is a police officer. Are you saying my aunt shouldn't have a job? You make it about you, and you make it about specific right, in that there's so much to unpack here. I think even the term white fragility can like really set a lot of people off and saying, what do you mean I'm fragile? Like this is offensive. And so it's almost ironic that the term is kind of self-evocative in that way. But it is an excellent thing that you bring up. A lot of people don't know this, but in 2018, we had folks from then Stand Up for Racial Justice. Now they're called NAWS in Queens. I apologize. It's escaping me right now what it stands for. But they're essentially white folks organizing against white supremacy with other white people in Queens, and they very graciously kind of came into the space of the campaign and decided to have these kinds of person-to-person conversations to say, listen, this is how you recognize, like, this is how these problems are manifesting from all of these kind of subconscious scripts that we have learned. And it's not your fault. It doesn't make you a bad person. You're not like you are not consciously choosing to do harm. We are just raised in a society that by default socializes a very large amount of racism in our interactions, in what we deem to be okay to say to other people, in our media, in how we are taught, and the images that we are seeing, and the policies that we are accustomed to recognizing as normal. In my work as a legislator, I do see it a lot. Congress is, I don't know. I mean, it changed a bit, but prior to this term, Congress was about 90% white, which means there are a lot of blind spots. I have seen a lot from legislators and experienced a lot. And it's really, really difficult to confront and to see how some folks' political comfort is prioritized above other people's ability to survive and to live. That's something that I have to see every day as a legislator. And I would be remiss, in your second part of your question about like, how do we reframe this issue, this word defund, right? That, your premise is that the word defund is kind of triggering and getting at this issue of fragility. And I think that you're right, because fragility, what it does is that you see someone asking about something and you make it about you, right? Like someone says defund the police, and then you say, oh, well, my aunt is a police officer. Are you saying my aunt shouldn't have a job? You make it about you, and you make it about specific people instead of actually seeing the big picture of what the person's trying to talk about and actually listening. And so I do think that, and I've seen it myself, a lot of the folks that are really scared and spooked around this issue of defund are distinctly people that have never really experienced the extent of brutality and violence that, or reality of policing that is why that's the reason why people are going to the street right now. But that doesn't make it any different, right? Like the other issue as well is that the center of the political universe in the House of Representatives. And it really points to a larger structure of power. It's not an accident. It's not an accident that the Electoral College is so fiercely defended because, listen, if the Electoral College delivered victories to people of color, if the Electoral College was responsible for and disproportionately weighed the voices of people of color, of women, of working class people, it would have been abolished by now. That's my hot take of the night. If the Electoral College amplified Black voices the way that it over-amplifies white voices, and it takes away the one person, one vote kind of structure of elections and principles of democracy, it would have been abolished by now. The Republican Party would have led on abolishing it because it's not about principle, it's about power. And they will readily abandon principle to preserve power. And so anyways, all of this is the discussion about reframing this conversation. And